Hello, welcome to today's City Club of Boise virtual conversation entitled Policing and Race, Reckoning with Our History and Planning Our Future. I am Shaakirrah Sanders. I am a professor of law at the University of Idaho College of Law, and I work here in Boise. I am also today's moderator. Thank you for joining us. I welcome our radio listeners who will be joining us via Boise State Public Radio on KBSX 91.5 and its affiliates throughout Southern Idaho and Northern Nevada. This program is being recorded and will be also posted on our YouTube channel. Today's forum is for our audience in large part because of our City Club partners and sponsors. I would like to thank some of the organizations that help us achieve our mission to ensure compelling conversations engage citizens in a dynamic community. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. Our annual sponsor is the University of Idaho, Boise. We also receive support from our forum series sponsors, AARP, Bank of Idaho, Climatech Corporation, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Developments, and St. Luke's Health System. City Club of Boise receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Thanks also to our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI, Idaho Statesman, and Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, BSU and NNU. Finally, I'd like to thank members of the City Club of Boise, the individuals and organizations who are foundational to our community. Thank you for your support. And if you're listening today and not yet a member, I encourage you to join. The City Club of Boise has convened a panel of experts for today's discussion. And I am joined by Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of New Haven, Ryan Lee, Chief of the Boise Police Department, and Leo Morales, Executive Director of the ACLU of Idaho. Thank you all for joining me here today. I've been asked to tell the audience a little bit about all of you. First, Lorenzo Boyd is a nationally recognized leader in police community relations and an authority on urban policing, diversity issues in criminal justice, race and crime, and criminal justice systems. Dr. Boyd received a Ph.D. in sociology from Northeastern University, a master's in applied sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a Bachelor of Arts in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Boyd served for 14 years in the Suffolk County, Massachusetts Sheriff Department. And in July 2020, Dr. Boyd was named the University of New Haven's Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. So congratulations, Dr. Boyd, on this recent achievement.
Thank you.
Ryan Lee was named Chief of Boise Police Department in June 2020. So congratulations to you as well, Chief Lee. Chief Lee holds a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice with an emphasis on law enforcement management and investigations from California State at Sacramento. Chief Lee also earned a master's in criminal justice from Boston University. Chief Lee is a veteran of the United States Coast Guard and served in Portland, Oregon for nearly 20 years, where he climbed from the ranks of officer to assistant chief of police before coming to Idaho. So welcome, Chief Lee. I would particularly love the Coast Guard background. I'm a former lifeguard at an international border here in the US, so we relied on you quite a bit. Leo Morales joined the ACLU in 2011 as the organization's communications and advocacy department director. Director Morales earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Boise State University and became the interim executive director of the ACLU of Idaho in 2014. In 2015, Director Morales took over the reins of the ACLU of Idaho, becoming the executive director. Prior to joining the ACLU, Leo Morales worked as a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization where he addressed issues of poverty and racial justice. His experience also includes legislative works, media relations, and grassroots organizing. So we have a little bit of community organizing in our shared background there. Leo, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So the City Club of Boise and this panel and I have agreed on the following format to get our discussion going. We'll begin with a 10-minute opening from Dr. Boyd, giving us a bit of a national perspective on our issue. We'll then pivot to Chief Lee, where he'll give us a Boise-focused perspective for about 5 minutes. And then for another 5 minutes, Leo Morales will seek to bridge that gap between the national and Boise perspectives. I will then proceed to some prepared questions, but I have also reserved much of our time for our panelists to respond to your questions. So for our audience members, you can use the Zoom's Q&A function by simply typing in your question, or you can email it to morgan@cityclubofboise.org. That's MORGAN @cityclubofboise.org. Morgan will then forward your questions to me. I will do my best to present each question, but in the interest of time, I may group similar questions together. I will also take the liberty to rephrase some of the questions for clarity, and if needed, to tone down any ratchetness or bias, if you will. So I will begin with Dr. Boyd with our opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone in Boise and in Idaho that are listening. Well, first of all, let's start off in the same place so that everybody is on the same page. When we talk about modern policing in a free and democratic society, let's acknowledge, first of all, that it involves a really delicate balance of three things. One, invoking police power, which we need the police to do. Number two is the use of coercion. And a lot of people take coercion as being negative, but coercion is when the police actually use communication to convince people to do something that they didn't want to do, or to convince them not to do something that they were planning to do. And the third leg of that is constitutional rights, acknowledging that people do not forfeit their constitutional rights when they are suspected of committing a crime. And they also do not forfeit constitutional rights when they're in custody. Because the one thing we do know in an investigation or a custodial interrogation, the first thing that the police tell you is that first, you do in fact have the right to remain silent, which is derived from the First Amendment of the Constitution. The second thing they tell you is you have the Fifth Amendment, I'm sorry. The second thing they tell you is you have the right to an attorney, which is the Sixth Amendment. So you do not forfeit constitutional rights. But we also acknowledge that in order for the police to maintain public order, the community has to trust and believe in their authority. And that's the starting point. Getting to the point where the public can get back to trusting and believing in the authority of the police. And we all can acknowledge that the line of demarcation towards modern policing is the murder of George Floyd. And jumping to the end, I think the best possible outcome for American policing is the fact that Derek Chauvin was in fact convicted on all counts, because that gets to show good police officers are different than some of the stuff that's going on here. And I maintain the fact that the vast majority of police officers in this country are in fact law-abiding, God-fearing citizens that are really trying to do the right thing, to get into the job for the right reason. But the flip side is we also have to acknowledge the negative history between public safety or law enforcement and people of color in this country. So we have to acknowledge that. And a lot of times when we take this stand and we talk about this, let's understand that people say that we have to heal and move forward, which I agree. But we can't stop at any point in time and decide from this point forward, we need to heal. because this process is a two-part process. First, it has to be diagnostic, then it has to be prescriptive. The prescriptive part is let's heal and move on. But the diagnostic part is you need to acknowledge the harm done to members of the community. You have to acknowledge that there has been a negative relationship between policing and people of color in this country ever since people of color were brought to this country in 1619. And when we talk about policing, a lot of people jump automatically to Sir Robert Peel, who introduced legislation in England in 1828, and it became law in 1829 that established the London Metropolitan Police, because that's the first time in our history as a world we saw a large-scale, uniformed, civilian-paid police department. And a lot of policing in America is built on the things that Sir Robert Peel has done. But we also have to acknowledge that we've had policing in this country a generation before, because prior to that, we also had slave patrols. And we have documentation, 1704 in South Carolina is the first time we have documents that pointed out slave patrols. And when you talk about what slave patrols are, they were white men on horses with long guns riding around the South looking for Black people that were not on plantations. And a lot of times they would capture them and sell them back into slavery. And let's acknowledge also that there were a lot of freed Black people in the South that were born free or earned their freedom or were given their freedom. And the fact that if you were not on a plantation, a lot of times the slave catchers or the slave patrol would grab you and then sell you into slavery is something we need to acknowledge. And if you look at the movie 12 Years a Slave, that was based on a true story where someone was coerced into coming south and then was sold into slavery. So at every point in our history, when we look at the relationship between the police and communities of color, we see levels of negativity, whether it's slave patrols or Jim Crow or Black Code or the civil rights struggle or stop and frisk or racial profiling. At every single point, there's been a negative relationship. So on the national stage, let's acknowledge, first of all, before we can heal and move on, let's acknowledge that there's been a negative relationship. Once you acknowledge that there's harm, then we can talk about moving forward. And there's a lot of progressive police chiefs around the country that are doing just that. They're acknowledging that this wasn't us, this wasn't what we were doing, but we acknowledge that the history was bad. And as soon as we can acknowledge that history, then we can move forward. And when we talk about the civil rights struggle, again, we're not talking 100 years ago. We're talking one generation ago. We're talking the 1960s. And a lot of the people that are protesting now, they weren't on the front lines getting beat up by the police or had the dog sick down or having firefighters hose them down. But a lot of their parents were and their grandparents were. And remember, the American history is an oral history. So we can't stop today and take a snapshot in time and say we have to move forward without acknowledging the past. But then if you look at the things that are going on right now, even if we separate ourselves from the past, there are things like Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Rayshard Brooks. There's a lot of cases that happened in the last few years where there are people of color that have watched the police take the lives of other people of color. And we acknowledge that that's problematic, but we also have to acknowledge there's a lot of people, particularly people of color, that are dealing with vicarious trauma. So then when you get good officers and good police chiefs coming out trying to engage the community, and they wonder why it is that people aren't engaging them, because we're not acknowledging the trauma that a lot of people have faced. And again, there's a lot of really good officers and a lot of really good police chiefs that are actually trying to do that. But again, I say let's acknowledge the vicarious trauma. Let's deal with the racial battle fatigue that happened. Because here's the analogy. If any of you have ever been bitten by a dog before, right after you get bit by a dog, chances are you're not out there playing with stray dogs because there's trauma that comes from getting bit by a dog. So how often do you need to get bit by a dog before you decide, I'm not going to play with dogs anymore? Or how often do you need to see other people get bit by dogs before you decide that I'm not going to play with dogs anymore? So when we look at that, there's a lot of people that have had negative relationships with the police, or that have seen negative relationships with the police, that, pardon the pun, they're a little gun shy and they're not really willing to work with the police. So now the onus is on the police. You still got to give them space. You still have to engage, because I still believe the vast majority of police officers are good people trying to do the right thing. But once you acknowledge the trauma, then you can begin the healing process. Thank you.
Dr. Boyd, thank you very much for that. I think it's actually a very good segue into talking a little bit about issues here in Boise. And so I think when we talk about race and policing in America, fundamental to that question is an examination of police legitimacy and the legitimacy of police procedures. And Boise had its own reckoning with police legitimacy over 20 years ago. The motivation behind it may not have been what we're experiencing in the national narrative now, but without diving deep into the history of the city, there were challenges and calls about whether or not the police were policing the community the way the community wanted to be policed. And we had to take this moment and look introspectively and figure out, how do we move forwards and how do we rebuild trust and legitimacy? And the predecessors in my position made the sound decision to invest heavily in a community policing model. And they took a model not just from a philosophical standpoint of engaging the community, not as somebody that we needed to patrol, not as somebody that we needed to police, but as a partner in ensuring public safety and in building a community that was welcoming to everyone. They recognized that we needed to sit down and not just philosophically advocate for that, but structurally change the police department. And so, unlike in many police departments in America, where we see the vast majority committed to patrol operations, the people that go out to 911 calls for service, the Boise Police Department is physically designed different, so that there is a heavy investment in strategic investigations and a community outreach division, an entire division of the department, almost the size of the patrol division, committed to doing community outreach. From that, we were able to start to build community connections, build trust, and build legitimacy, but we recognized that that was not enough. As the demographics of the city of Boise began to change over time, for those of you unfamiliar, the State Department uses Boise, they recognize it as one of the top refugee relocation cities in the United States. It's one of the top 6. And so why, if we take a snapshot of the demographics of the city of Boise, it may not look as diverse as the reality of how it is. Because we need to look at the larger snapshot of the community. We need to recognize it's not just who's in the city limits that comes to Boise. It's people that come here for work, people that come here to recreate, people that come here for entertainment, the people that engage in conversations like this one at the City Club, coming from a very diverse set. When we recognize the need to continue to enhance and invest in a community policing model and built a refugee liaison program, that program became recognized as a national standard of best practice. We had much larger police departments begin to seek out as to how we built these connections to network with everybody from predominant members of the refugee communities to the everyday person in the refugee community dealing with the struggles of coming to a new country and trying to build a safe and prosperous life for them and their family. And so we presented information at the Major City Chiefs Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and we began to model forward this as a sound approach. But we recognized that that was not enough. We began to deliberately build panels to ensure that the Citizens Chiefs Advisory Panel, that there was input from as diverse a segment of the population as possible, to include a subset of that panel, specifically focusing on diversity and equity and inclusion. We have a diverse panel from corporate business leaders in our community all the way down to people that have served time in prison. We need to hear from every voice so that we can provide the best policing service possible that those communities and those community members, as they represent, want from us. We also recognize that simply looking outside at the community and asking what does the community need was not enough for us to face the challenging times that laid ahead for American policing. And so well before the national call for procedural justice or implicit bias training, we committed on a path to sit down, look, examine, and begin to deliver training and education to our own department, and have had several iterations now of implicit bias and procedural justice training in an effort to look introspectively in the mirror to see what we bring to the equation, not just what is there when we arrive. And so I think that Boise is well positioned to help move forwards as a template. We've committed strongly to the ideals that we are not law enforcement officers, but we are police officers. And fundamental to policing is the idea that we are there to guard every member of our community, that the sanctity of human and civil rights is core to the very value of our institution. So much so that the culminating exercise for every Boise Police Academy is to visit the Anne Frank Memorial for Human Rights in downtown Boise, to have a lecture from the police chief about the risk of how policing can be co-opted or corrupted if it only is entertaining political agendas and not the higher callings, right? We should not be about politics, but we must be about principles and committed to the cause. And so I think that Boise offers in its own snapshot a template for the way police departments can move forwards in the future to recognize and hear the trauma from our community and to help build meaningful connections to deliver appropriate police service. And with that, Mr. Morales, I'd like to hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Chief Lee, and thank you, Dr. Boyd, as well for your comments and opening. I guess I want to start off by thanking the City Club staff and volunteers for putting this together. It takes work to put something together, so I want to recognize that. Second, I want to acknowledge as well and put at the forefront community members and leaders who have been doing this work of ending police violence and racism throughout the history of our country. I think it's very important to remember and recall our ancestors who have been in this struggle, leaders of the movement for Black Lives, in the modern day version of our movement, really, right? And acknowledge that because we sit in the middle of the arc, I would say. We sit in the middle of the arc of progress. From the start of, as Dr. Boyd mentioned, the American police system started as a way to organize power to round up Black community members, right? That was the start in America. And I call it with that, and I say that we're in the middle of the arc because it's very important to look back to where we are at now, and where we want to be in the future. For me personally, it brings a lot of joy in the work that I do when I'm able to think about the future and envision the possibilities of building a system that truly is working towards life-affirming care for all community members, right? Regardless of your status, regardless of your skin color, regardless of whether you are in power or not. I think it's very critical to envision new systems that, once again, put the focus back on life-affirming care. And I believe that the police, the role of the police and the role of government is today's conversation, of course. There are possibilities there, and as Chief Lee indicated, Boise can be a model. We are a local community where we can work together. And I want to also emphasize that the focus is community as well, right? I think that in today's conversation, we're having conversations about the police and police department, but the focus also turning to community and what the role of the community is as well. As others have indicated, and what we have seen throughout history, as a community, there's been a significant amount of almost like push to police, reliance of police for a lot of things, where I would say even police are saying, all right, enough is enough. How much, we are doing way too much, right? And so I think that we are in the middle of the arc of progress to ask ourselves very deep questions around what is the role of the police, right? What is the role of the police, and how and what are we doing structurally to create the space for community? Because community has answers as well. And I think that's so important, particularly in the movement that we have now around racism, is to center the community's voice. Because oftentimes what we see throughout history is that progress is made as well when community comes together and thinks about, a way to take care of ourselves. I'll end with this, and it's a story that I learned around how the system of the ambulance got started. So prior to the 1960s, if someone was hurt in the community, there were two ways really. Either you call the police and they would put you in their vehicle and take you to the hospital, or you would call a funeral home and they would take you in their vehicle, right? Because they have the type of cars where someone can lay down. That was in the 1960s. And it wasn't until a group of community members through an organization called Freedom House came together and actually realized, look, we can't, first of all, particularly in Black communities, and these were Black-led, this was a Black-led organization where even there were times that they would call the police and police would not show up. And so Freedom House developed a system where they worked with impacted community members and eventually developed what we today know as the EMS, right, system. And that, again, is an example of community ingenuity and what happens when we give the power to the community as creativity is well alive and we develop systems that can last generation. And so I end with that because it's a point of hope. And it's a point that we can do better. And I believe that the city of Boise can structure conversations so that we can lead in this country as we reckon with our history of racism and policing. So again, I'll end there, pass it back to you, Professor Shaakirrah Sanders.
Thank you all for those opening remarks. Quite a bit to think about. And so much ground covered, quite a bit of ground that was in my prepared questions. I'm also happy to report that we've got a number of questions in our Q&A and questions that we've received via email. So I do want to reserve the majority of my time to get those questions in. So for our audience members, if you are still contemplating whether or not you would like to send a question, you can use the Zoom Q&A functions by simply typing in your question, or you can email your question to morgan@cityclubofboise.org. That's MORGAN @cityclubofboise.org. So I'm going to dive right in to one of the questions I prepared. And this is the one where I begged your forgiveness about its length, but I think it sort of frames us up very well for the questions that are in our chat and in our Q&A. And it also sort of connects us to what everyone has been talking about. So here, the Vera Institute of Justice has reported that African Americans make up, and let me preface this by saying that we know it is very hard to find accurate statistics here in Idaho on its jail and prison population, particularly by demographics. And that's a whole conversation, right? Why it is so difficult to find that information. But here, the Vera Institute of Justice has reported that African Americans make up approximately 1% of Idaho's total population, but approximately 3% of Idaho's jail and prison population. Very similar statistic when it comes to Indigenous and Native Americans. 1% of the state population, but here 4% of our jail and prison population. Latinx and Hispanic, 12% of our state population, 20% of our jails and prisons. Yet for two demographics, Asian Americans and Caucasian or white Americans, their percentage of the population seems to be lower than their percentage of the prison population. For Asian Americans, approximately 2% of the state population, but less than 1% of our jail population. White and Caucasian, 84% of our state population, 69% of our jail population. How do we find out more about these statistics and what is leading to these impacts, these different impacts? How do we also find out more about policing in different communities of color? We know a lot about the national point of view, but how do we find out more about what happens here in Idaho? So Chief Lee, I'll start with you, then we'll pivot to Leo Morales, and then Dr. Boyd.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Sanders. I think part of the challenge when we look at this question is there are a lot of deeper issues that lie in it. I'll start first with saying, often when police are called and there's an interface with the criminal justice system that may result in an arrest or some form of enforcement action, we often just look at that at a very superficial level when comparing it to demographics of a population. I think it's important to recognize that frequently when police are called to a location, it's because the social support networks that some members of our community may enjoy, other members of our community, especially the marginalized communities, may not have those same support networks, and the police become accessed as part of that support network, or somebody accessing us to provide support, or a view that we need something because there's a disturbance going on, as an example, where maybe the argument that became heated in another community, there might have been people other than the police to respond to that, to assist. And so I think we have to sit down and look at all of the factors as to why do some of those social support networks, why are they not as dominant in certain communities that we see that make up Idaho? Where have we as a society failed to build the infrastructure so that it's accessible for everybody, so that, as we mentioned, as Mr. Morales mentioned, the police are called upon for a variety of different things, often maybe even too much. Why are we being called to these communities that result in some of that enforcement action? But even that is a part of this equation that we need to understand, but it's difficult to understand here in Idaho when many of the data capture mechanisms don't exist that we see maybe in some other communities. I'll use as an example, if any of you unfortunately have maybe received a traffic ticket in the state of Idaho, you'll notice that there is no racial demographic information on the citation. The ability to capture that and then to extrapolate from that, are there trends in enforcement? Are there things that we're seeing that, whether implicit or explicit, that are going on? How can we help to address them as an organization? Whether that's, where's the information that we can extrapolate? Dr. Sanders, you mentioned it's very hard to capture information on the prison population demographically. What about in the court system, and whether or not we can extract that data to make some determination about, is there a disparity in sentencing approaches? Those mechanisms are not there for us to begin to capture the information we need to be able to be reflective as an institution that also reflects the greater community and adapt to that. So I would posit that some of this is really a legislative and a structural challenge to help us get the information so we can do the meaningful work that needs to happen. And with that, I'll gladly pass the microphone.
Thank you, Chief Lee. Well, first, on the numbers and the stats that you point out, as national information, Idaho information. I mean, one, I want to remind ourselves again that, again, we tend to see kind of the racial injustice in those numbers. And I think that's one. Second, I think as Chief Lee is saying too, I think the data is so critical. There's both a collection of information, which I believe that local communities, local police departments, whether that's sheriff's office, city offices, should be able to set up a system to collect this information. That's one. Second, I think that there's also then the conversation around releasing that information, right? So moving in a direction where we actually publicly release as much information as possible to the community and make it as accessible as well, right? Because that's where I think that there's a significant amount of creativity for solutions as well. That once we begin to report our information, academics can look into it, community can look into it, individuals looking to create new systems can look into it. And that, again, I think is the beauty of working with community and making sure that, one, where we have institutions that are, if police are stopping individuals, we have to develop these systems to collect the information, but then turn around and put it out there. There are national initiatives in place now, I believe, where certain police departments belong to that are actually working creatively with data to collect the data and put the data out there. I don't know whether the city of Boise is part of this national, I believe it's transparency initiative or something to that effect. I'm skipping the name right now, but I do believe there may be only one in the state of Idaho, and I think it's the Coeur d'Alene Police Department that's participating in this national initiative. So again, it's setting up the systems now to the extent that we have power. And second, I mean, I think that, cities have a big role to play because cities give significant amount of power to local police as well, right? Created by ordinances. I don't believe that police departments are actually in the Constitution. And so police and states have a significant amount of power, right? And so I think that knowing that local police And cities of a significant power can also structure the system for data collection, but equally important is the dissemination of information in a way that is accessible to community members.
You know, I'd like to push back a little bit on the question, just a little bit. In full transparency, I spend the bulk of my life being critical of police and police action. That's kind of what I do as a police researcher. But the problem with the question is it points too much to the police and it lets the rest of the criminal justice system off the hook, because the police are the gatekeepers that bring people in. We need to also focus in on prosecutors, because a lot of prosecutors make deals with certain people and not others. Prosecutors look for certain sentences for certain people and not others. In corrections, people are incarcerated at higher levels for one group than the other. So although the police are the gatekeepers, it's not the police's issue alone. And if we make it a policing issue, then we give a pass to the rest of the system. And let's acknowledge that the criminal justice system is broken. There are different rules for different people, because we incarcerate far more people of color than in their population. And we also incarcerate far more on a national level, far more people at or below the poverty line. We don't incarcerate rich people nearly to the extent that we incarcerate other people. The average literacy rate of people that are incarcerated is between 5th and 7th grade. So this is a systemic failure, and we can't just hang this just on the police. The police have their part, but this is not a policing problem. This is a system problem.
Thank you, thank you. And of course, as a professor of criminal procedure, I definitely agree with the need to look at the system as a whole. But I did want to focus our question on the law enforcement end, given our panel. So for Director Leo Morales, I can confirm there is no law enforcement clause in the Fourth Amendment. And Chief Lee, I saw the mayor's office is on the phone, so I will be taking the fifth on whether or not I have any citations here in Boise. I wanted to pivot to one of the questions that we got in the chat, and I will freely acknowledge my desire for this question because it intersects with some of my legal research, which is, what are current procedures for responding to calls where there is a mental health issue, and what can we do to improve the process for those who suffer from mental illnesses when they are in our jails and prisons? I'll just provide a little context here. Idaho does not have an insanity defense. We are also underfunded in many areas. One of those is mental health. And we do have a high rate of mental illness in our state in comparison with other states. So I thought this was just such a great question that I wanted to make sure that we got it out there. So Leo Morales, we'll start with you this time. Then we'll pivot to Dr. Boyd, and then we'll pivot to Chief Lee, who I suspect would have quite a bit to say on this with regards to procedures for at least for Boise.
Thank you, Professor Sanders. Yeah, so, and you'll hear in a second, folks will see what my theme is, right? And again, this is where that community creativity is important with regards to the needs of the community. This is an area that I think is important to focus. And this, again, to my earlier point, that there are areas where police say, look, is that really the role of the police, right? And I think that's a critical question, because I think there are places where there should be a divorce. That there are different models out there, and there are new models being imagined for how we work with community members, where it may not make sense to have law enforcement be the first responders on the scene. I'll point to one program in Eugene, and Chief Lee may know more about this than myself, being from Oregon, the Cahoots program, right? So this is a mobile crisis program where it's a partnership with multiple individuals that take care of community. And this is crisis counseling, suicide prevention, assessment and intervention, conflict resolution, mediation, housing crisis, first aid, non-emergency responders. The individuals are not trained as law enforcement individuals. However, again, they have a team of individuals that actually go to community and help deal with these situations where, you know, it probably doesn't make sense to, again, have law enforcement as the first responders. And so whether it's cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, or whether it's different programs like are being experimented in Denver, Colorado as well, there are different places where I think that what you bring up and the questioner brings up is how do we deal and what is the process? I think there's also, this is a perfect place to actually re-examine what is the community response to actually take that control back to community and be able to take care of our community in a way that is a response that's with life-affirming type of approach.
I think the reliance, and I agree with Director Morales, the reliance on policing is part of the problem. Because if I had my druthers, I would rather have somebody with a master's degree in social work or a master's degree in mental health actually dealing with this. There's a significant number of calls that the police get that you do not need a sworn person with a firearm responding, particularly when my loved one or my family member is in crisis. We don't need somebody with a firearm necessarily. So increasing the amount of first responders that have mental health backgrounds. And across the country, on average, most police officers are doing 4 or 6 hours of mental health training, as opposed to somebody with a master's degree and some clinical background. So if we start employing some of these people in police departments, and even if they're not solo responders, even if they're co-responding with somebody that's a police officer, have them take the lead and the officer as a backup, I think that's a safe position to be in. But again, a lot of police officers are forced into these positions and they're taking calls that they don't need to take. So if we kind of even this out a little bit and push back, because society tends to treat the police as a social dumpster, and then we get really upset when the police can't do all the things that we're forcing them to do. So if we increase social work in alliance with policing, I think that's a good strategy moving forward.
Dr. Boyd, I appreciate that perspective because it ties in well with the philosophy here in Boise. So to bring it back to the local perspective, one of the things that I recognized when I came here was, as you mentioned, many police professionals in the United States have minimal training in, crisis intervention and mental health. One of the first things I was able to do, if there was any benefit at all to the pandemic, was that there were some overtime savings that occurred from events that just weren't happening, that we didn't have the staff. We were able to redirect that money and deliver 40 hours of crisis intervention training to every sworn member of the Boise Police Department. The significance of that is that 40 hours is generally the benchmark for building specialized crisis intervention teams to respond as police officers and ensure that de-escalation and mental health awareness training at a higher level was delivered to every sworn member of this department, from the brand new recruit all the way to me as the chief of police. We ensured that we had that level of training or greater. For those people that had opted in early, we're building enhanced related training. We also have a behavioral health response team that pairs a clinician with an officer to go out, so that we're not just going at those moments of acute crisis for people that are frequently accessing accessing police services when really what they need is mental health services. What we've recognized here and what I've seen in other places where I've served is that there are members that are affected by mental health related issues that often are seeking out police because of the believed events that they're experiencing. And sometimes they want that police contact. They don't want a social worker or mental health care professional, but by pairing them with somebody, when we can go in a moment when it's not an acute crisis, have the police officer there, so they're feeling that they have that access to police service, but we also have the expert clinician to try and get them the services that really address the root cause problem. That gives us a greater tool. I think really though, when we step back and look at this at a larger scale, it talks a little bit about some of the challenges I mentioned earlier, which is, what systems do we have to support various different communities? The mental health care system in America is inadequate, to be frank, and it's not accessible for every member of our community, especially our marginalized communities. And unfortunately, there are going to be events where, because of the volatility of the situation, police are the appropriate responders, but we need to minimize how frequent those occur, and we need to ensure that those responders that show up have the best training for the most likely positive outcome that we can seek. So that's a little bit of the framework around our approach here in the city of Boise.
Great, thank you. During my time as a public defender in Washington, I worked in the mental health courts, and it was one of the more collaborative experiences I've had when I think about the relationship between the public defender, the social worker, law enforcement, and the prosecutor, all of whom were committed to finding the best outcome for the individual. So I want to pivot to more of the questions in our chat. And so here we have a few questions that really relate to race and policing. And so here one question is, what is the City Club of Boise Police Department doing to share their efforts with other Idaho communities and to encourage anti-racism and cultural understanding elsewhere? Now, this question was specifically sort of positioned as one about what's Boise doing, but I'd love to hear from all of our panelists on this in general about what all police departments can do. I know we touched upon this, and if you, I think in Dr. Boyd's opening remarks, he also touched upon sort of some of this history. And for me, I think that's a lot of it. Is always not clear to me whether law enforcement understands the history that some of our communities have. So I also wonder, what can law enforcement communities do to show communities that they're serving that they understand that history between law enforcement and their communities? So I think at this point, we may have either rotated. Leo, did you go first last time? Yes, so we rotated back to Dr. Boyd. So we'll start with you, Dr. Boyd, then we'll rotate to Chief Lee, and then Leo Morales.
On a national level, I think part of the problem is that there is a disconnect between police and the communities they serve. Many police departments only engage with policing when they're called out. And Chief Lee made a fantastic point that it's not law enforcement we're talking about, it's policing. Because when you talk about law enforcement, enforcing criminal law as it applies to index crime is only about 20% of what the police actually do. The vast majority of their time is service. And there are some police departments, including Northeastern University in Boston, which does the police academy supplemental for Boston and for Cambridge. Every Friday for the cadets, it's half a day, because the second half of the day, the cadets are assigned to community groups, either Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA or Parks and Recs or something like that, because they want the cadets to interact with these young people in non-enforcement ways. So then when they get on the job, they already have an understanding of the norms and mores in the community. The other part of the problem is when you get police officers from these far-reaching suburbs and bring them into a city to police, that's problematic because there's not the buy-in, there's not the understanding. So the more we can get officers to interact with community members, get out of their cars and interact with people in non-enforcement ways, the better things are going to be.
And can I just interrupt here? Should some of that history be part of what you learn in your police academy?
100%. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because you have to understand the lived experience of the people that you're policing. And part of that lived experience is the history. Absolutely. Every police department, without question.
That's actually a great segue to an anecdote that I think will illustrate some of this. So I absolutely think that we have to talk about the history of policing to understand the context of where different members of our community may be coming. We need to know what enters into the conversation. As part of my police career, I had the good fortune of being able to do some research for the National Institute of Justice. That's the Department of Justice's research arm over in Europe. While I was over there, I had the opportunity to visit the Bavarian State Police Academy. In Germany, every police department has the exact same standard of training. And I'll come back to the issue of standard of training here in a second. But they have a much more encompassing amount of education, not just training that goes into the development of a police officer, but a cornerstone to their training was to talk about the atrocities of the Holocaust and the role that the police played in it. The Bavarian State Police Academy happens to be in Dachau, the infamous Dachau. And I had the good fortune to sit down with the college professor that came in and taught to the police academy over the course of a very protracted training cycle, over and over again, revisit this issue and educate it. And it struck me as incredibly important to American policing that we could learn from this, that there was this opportunity to recognize that rather than take an atrocity and say, we cannot speak of the past, they embraced the fact that that was part of their history. They needed to understand it. They needed to move forward from it. They needed to be ever vigilant not to slip and slide back anywhere near it. And it is very much ingrained in the training of the police officer. It goes to part of the challenge we have in American policing. The standard of American policing is so grossly varied, yet we often hear of what the officer does in St. Petersburg, Florida, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Elizabeth City, North Carolina, somehow gets reflected back onto what we are doing here in Boise. And I think that we need to recognize that with the local models of policing, without an insistence upon a base national standard to build upon, it makes a very apples and oranges comparison. We would not talk about, what a teacher teaches maybe in Florida and immediately compare it to what's being taught in Seattle, Washington. Yet that's what happens with policing. In Germany, the commitment to professional development of policing, to include talking about the dark history of German policing, their commitment, basic police academy in Germany is 2 years long, field trainings an additional 6 months. We as an American society need to be willing to do that sort of investment if we expect that sort of professional result. We need to find those non-enforcement opportunities to connect the police with the community, as Dr. Boyd spoke about. But I think more importantly is we need to look for opportunities where we can interface, we, the police, can interface with the greater public, not as the police. Because by the very nature of going to, whether it's the Y or the Boys and Girls Club, if we show up as Officer Lee, the role of me as the police infers some sort of power dynamic based off our roles into that conversation. One of the programs I was able to work with through a nonprofit at my last agency was to actually look at all of the new officers that were coming aboard and offer them sponsor families as they acculturated into the new role of policing and into that new community. And what we deliberately sought out were not necessarily the person that was the rah police supporter, but somebody that wanted to look at somebody entering into the profession as a new neighbor and talk to them. And we were able to frankly engineer conversations and decontextualize the role of police and change the dynamic to where the police officer was vulnerable and needed help acculturating to this community, needed help adjusting to a new job, needed to just be a human being. And the value of making that connection and the way it changed the context of how they interacted with the community. One, as Dr. Boyd reiterated my point, it moved it one away from simply being the law enforcement officer, one of the worst terms we could have ever adopted. It changed it to one where it was about being a police officer and about being a protector, because during those most challenging times, whether it was hearing that somebody was victimized horribly, being in a critical event, they could reflect back and say, I am taking on these burdens and these challenges for the people that are reflective of those that have invited me into this community. And it gave them an anchor. I think more programs and more opportunities like that are incredibly important as we move forward into the future of policing, both here in Boise as well as a nation.
My 2 cents here. Again, there are times and places where, again, going back to the focus on the community, where where like we need to divorce that relationship or reliance of police being everywhere, right? And again, this is where the movement is asking for, like, how do we actually create and imagine brand new systems where we create systems where, community completely has a new system to take care of ourselves as well. Over the years and decades, the police across the country has just grown immensely and continues to grow, right? And I think that again, turning back the perspective of what does the community want, what do we need, and where should we divorce? Again, this is the theme that I'm repeating, and I'm going to continue to, because I think it's important to understand that there's an important conversation to be had about the role of the police. How do we divorce certain areas? How do we create new structures? Because as Dr. Boyd said earlier, part of the issue that we have in this country, not just this country, in the world, is there's a significant amount of trauma, not just for POC, right, communities of color, but also within law enforcement as well. You know, law enforcement themselves carry a significant amount of trauma that sometimes can lead to potentially unintended consequences or potentially intended consequences. But the point is that we are at a critical point where we have to absolutely stop and rethink about what are the new strategies for how do we involve with community with regards to the issue of race. And, you know, there's already a very broken relationship there, very, very broken relationship. You know, in the state of Idaho, of course, the largest community of color is the brown community, the Latinx community, the Hispanic community. And there's a significant amount of just no trust, right? The level of trust there is low. And the reporting of incidents, it just doesn't happen. It's just not happening because individuals, either because of language, either because they've had a bad experience, or when they dare to actually call the police and then their case was investigated and it came back with like unfounded or something, right? It's just like that's broken. And so, you know, I would say that, yes, there's a role of police, but there's also what the movement is calling for is a deep cry to just pause and think about how do we turn the perspective back on community and what's needed as well.
Wow, what a great discussion today. And as I look at the clock, we are at approximately 12:58. And I am not one to fiddle with people's schedules, especially in the summertime, where as a professor, I pretty much tend to transform into a person I like to call Summer Shaakirrah. So I do want to acknowledge that there were so many great questions waiting in our queue, some questions about improving transparency, the complaint and disciplinary process, recruitment and diversity of our police department, transparency in the number of stops, arrests, frisks, community oversight, leadership, unions and other types of organizations that our police department belongs to, members of our department belong to, and also how do our law enforcement officers deal and talk about race in wake of our state legislatures legislation seeming to disapprove of those types of conversations. So much more that we could have talked about today, but I am so happy with what we did get to talk about today. And with the collegial tone of our conversation, I want to thank all of those who listened in today for all of your wonderful questions, not a ratchet one amongst you, which I am just I think makes everyone feel so welcome and pleased. So with that, we are just at the 1 o'clock hour, and I will end our conversation by saying thank you to Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, Chief Ryan Lee, and Leo Morales, Director of the ACLU of Idaho. I am Shaakirrah Sanders, your moderator, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon.